Good. How are you guys?
Doing good. Do you prefer Will?
For the next 40-ish minutes, yes. That would,
Okay,
yeah, Mr.
cool.
Shingleton sounds a little too formal for this probably.
Okay, awesome. I appreciate that. I appreciate you coming on the pod today. We're just gonna gab about some psychology here. You want to take it off first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start off because I just wanted to get a good intro question, what made you decide to dedicate your life to psychology? And did you grow up in Alabama? I know that's where you got your degree from.
Okay, so I'll answer the second one first. I did grow up in Alabama. I was born in Birmingham, downtown Birmingham, UAB Hospital. Um, I mostly grew up in a town called Hoover, though, which is about 5 miles south of downtown Birmingham. It's kind of like a Simpsonville to Birmingham or Simpsonville to Greenville kind of deal. In terms of psychology stuff, I don't want to say it was an accident, but it wasn't necessarily plan A. Like I thought and if this sounds familiar, um, probably a lot of your peers, Paris, are going through something pretty similar. When I was doing my undergraduate degree, I was not entirely sure what my future career path was going to be. I went for a humanities degree, which in hindsight, I think was a good choice for how it turned out, but it wasn't necessarily like the best way to get a job immediately out of college. Um, it did give me some flexibility though. So when I did eventually figured out what I wanted to do, I wasn't pigeonholed into one particular thing. So like I majored in English and Spanish at Alabama. And there you can do a lot of things with those two degrees, but you can also do no things with those degrees. So I was kind of in that pretty classic millennial situation of getting out of college and not really being sure what the next step was going to be. And, the job opportunities that I was like sort of getting closer to was like being a recruiter or working as like a very low level banking person. And I was just like, that's not what I have envisioned for my life. So eventually, and I think I mentioned this in class, I sort of had the idea, something that my sister, because she was a big swimmer and had worked with a sports psychologist for a long time, thought, well, that might be cool, and looked into all of the various schoolings that you have to do to go be a sports psychologist. And as a very happy coincidence, I was actually in another master's program for something called human performance at Alabama, and then West Alabama, which is another school in a completely different town. They were just starting to offer an experimental slash sports psychology degree that was online. So I wouldn't have to go live in Livingston, which was nice. And I could study something I was actually interested in. And so a couple of very happy things came together at once. And I did that thinking that I was going to be a sports psychologist, and it just didn't quite work out that way. I'm more on the academic side of things, at least partly because I don't want to work with parents, because that's a big part of being a sports psychologist. I'm just not all that interested in um, having conversations with their parents about like why their 12-year-old isn't playing tennis well enough. Like
Yeah.
that's what I ended up kind of turning me off to doing that vocationally. But yeah, that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but that's kind of how we got here.
Definitely.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I mean, a lot of times I feel like philosophy can kind of verge over into psychology, and I don't know what specific disciplines outside of sports psychology you might be interested with or familiar with, but Carl Jung and Nietzsche, and you know, I just, I guess I want your interpretation on that, and if you've read on them or how you feel about it, because people have a lot of mixed feelings about Carl Jung and specifically. So,
Yeah, so it's a interesting idea because this is a dynamic that at the very beginning of our Psych 201 class we explore in pretty good detail because initially psychology and philosophy were running a lot closer together, like in the initial phases pre-Wilhelm Wundt, kind of transitioning psychology into a more hard science. Because a lot of times you'll hear people describe psychology as a soft science. And like if you want to get on like a psychology person's nerves, that would be a very easy way to do it. because it is very much not in a lot of ways, and that's a big part of what differentiates it from philosophy. Because there are definitely philosophical principles that get worked into all of these varying psychological theories, but philosophy is sort of the pursuit of knowledge and epistemology and the way people think and process and sort of breaking down an idea at its very core elements. Like that is a piece of the puzzle, and Jung was way into that because he was kind of in that early group. Jung, Freud, a few other of their contemporaries, Alfred Adler, like people sort of in that group. Rorschach would be on that list too. Like they are people that we refer back to in our psychology class relatively regularly, but Paris can tell you this. I don't refer to them with a whole lot of love, I guess is the way to describe it. Fondness, because I would definitely trend more a little bit more in the other direction, which is more and on the hard science side of things, and the more
Clinically.
yeah, and the more like empirical piece of it. Because my degree is in experimental psych, so I'm like a big research guy. And
Makes
that's one
sense.
of the hard things about like philosophy is we can't really study it in the same way. We can't really structure an experiment to say, this person's right or this person's right. We don't, that's not really how it works. It's fundamentally like about systems of thought and ideas themselves rather than sort of, I can tell you how the brain processes ideas and I
Yeah.
can, look at a brain scan and say, okay, um, here's the systems that kind of make us feel a particular way about a particular stimulus. But when it comes to breaking down, again, the philosophical elements of that, that's not really my thing, but it is an important thing, and it's very much an important part of kind of how we got to the point where we are now, psychologically speaking.
I think it's staying with that. The law of attraction is
Mhm.
such a unique thing, and there's this mysticism behind it, and it's kind of tied to, like you said, the soft science of it, but it's very interesting how people are more inclined to make decisions or fall into cycles of behavior because they envision the steps they might need to take within their life to get to the next goal. So I think that's, I don't know, how do you feel about that?
In terms of being able to like visualize how to get to a point, this is why things like representation are really important. This is a big thing for me, both in depicting people of particular genders, people of particular races, people having disabilities or not, showing them in a situation where they can get to a certain point career-wise, um, and the relationships that they can form and the jobs that they can get, like all of that is very important because if you don't have that frame of reference, if you don't have that ability to, if not, plan it out specifically, if you don't have any, like I said, frame of reference, any conception of what that would look like being able to say, and people underrate that. People think, okay, well, just, make it happen. Like, why do you need a reference point? Why do you need an example of somebody, getting to a particular place? I'm trying to think of an example, but okay, this is a great one. It kind of refers back to so I'm a big sports guy. Paris will tell you that I refer back to sports things pretty much constantly. So my team, Tottenham, they're my favorite soccer club. They won a very important trophy this week. They won the Europa League, and their manager, this guy named Ange Postecoglou, is the first manager ever outside of Europe or Argentina to win that particular competition, any European competition. That's a big deal because it's really important to the club and their fans, but it's also a big deal because if you are a person who grew up in Mexico or he's from Australia, if you grew up in Asia, like you wouldn't have no, like why would you think that it would be possible for you to be a manager in the Premier League or go and be a general manager of a team in the NFL? Like you don't have a frame of reference for that. You have no way to think, okay, well, these are the steps I need to take. These are the people that I need to get in contact with. This is the degree I need to get. Like you don't have a path. There's no, yeah, there's no, I keep saying frame of reference because that's the best way to describe it. There's no, so much of psychology and being able to plan out what might happen and sort of use your working memory to be able to make decisions comes from having a reference. Comes from having, okay, well, this is kind of what this person did, so I should probably emulate it and model, use their model as a way to structure the way that I'm going to try this. And if you
Learn
don't have that,
behavior.
there's a very good chance it's not going to happen.
Sure. I'm gonna hand it off to Paris there. She's had to flee. She's got a question as well.
Yeah.
Because I actually do remember I think it might be a Nietzsche quote that Jack talked to me about where it was basically um like this idea in philosophy where you need to basically envision yourself, but also have learning things changes who you are.
Mhm.
So, we are basically just collectives of memories and I like things that we've seen and we emulate that in our lives and what we feel like best represents us.
Yeah, and we talk a lot in Psych 201 and in the psychology more broadly about modeling and about sort of the way that your experiences and your influence shape you. Like, and that's an incredibly important part of, being a human person, but especially if we're talking about a particular outcome. And in talking about like so I'll use like visualization as an example of this kind of thing. Like that's an incredibly important thing in sports psychology. I have my sports psychology textbooks behind me on our bookshelf. Like they will tell you that being able to, if you are on the 18th green at the Masters, like, and you're a hole away from winning the most important tournament in the world, you need to be able to visualize, driving the ball into the fairway, hitting a good approach shot, putting the ball into the hole, like being able to plan that out and have some idea of how you're going to get there is one of the biggest predictors of a good outcome. And that's true. It's from my point of view, it's also kind of tough to say that sometimes because going back to the frame of reference thing, you don't have one. You don't have an ability to, say, okay, well, this is the thing I need to do to get to that next step. This is where a lot of questions about like sort of our particular groups, our particular people more likely to have success comes into it because there's no, it's until you see it happen, like so a group of people could always say, well, this other group of people over here just doesn't do that. That's not their thing. That's not what they're built for. And then it actually does happen, and that entire argument starts to crumble. But that's yeah, just to reiterate that like having an example to refer back to of like, okay, well, this is what this person did in this situation. That not only encourages your own belief in what you can do, but it also on a more like broad level of saying like, okay, well, I can see that this person had success, so it's possible. But now I also have a very concrete idea of these might be the steps I need to take, and even if it doesn't look exactly like what this other person did, like it can at least be a model to base your own ideas on.
I know you're a big sports guy, so um, thinking about it from 2 points of view with CTE, having, this love for a game and it's built into who you are, your identity, you love it, and you're playing this sport, it's a facet of your life. It might even take you places where you might be famous or have an amazing career or something like that, get a bunch of money, but in the long run might affect your brain and how it works. And do you think losing that function is worth the cultural aspect of, your connection to it?
Well, I'm going to upgrade something you said slightly. It
All right,
might
go
kill
for
you might die. Like that's part of
it.
the risk of CTE. Like it's not just something we've learned. When some of the most famous case studies of CTE have been people who have either committed suicide or have had their lives degrade to a point that organs start to break down and they literally die. Like that is sort of what's at risk here in terms of like weighing the risk of that, which is significant. We're sort of the biggest sport implicit in this conversation is football. Like, obviously, if you are repeatedly ramming your head into somebody else's head and various other parts, that is going to be dangerous, and you're going to be at a much higher risk of developing CTE. I don't know how to tell somebody well that they shouldn't do something, especially if the rewards are so potentially significant. And that only applies to a very, very, very small percentage of people who that would, actually affect. Like most people, despite what some of those sports psychology parents might tell you, your kid's probably not going to play college ball. And they're probably not going to play in the NFL. It's almost the percentage of people that actually do that is negligible. But for the people that do have that possibility, I don't know how to tell them that. I don't know how to say, like, again, the risk of you doing this is incredibly high relative to other people. And, you have to go into doing this sport with that understanding. Like, how long can you take it? How long can you subject yourself to that risk? And, some people have just said no. Like Luke Kuechly, the former linebacker for the Carolina Panthers, he quit at the peak of his career because he was just like, I made enough money, I've had enough success, I've had a couple of concussions, I'm out. And like, I love that as a model for, showing people that that's possible. Um, but I'm also not in the camp where, like, I still think this is a problem that can be fixed, or at least sort of significantly had the risk reduced. I had a conversation a while back with the director of the Michigan Concussion Center. So he's like one of the foremost researchers on CTE, specifically in football. And that was really enlightening for me because at no point in that conversation was it like, this is a fatal problem. Like, this is not football's not going to be on the chopping block. We can still, like, hopefully figure this out and make this tenable in the long term. So much of the research that they've done on making helmets safer and limiting the amount of exposures to hard hits, especially in practice. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that you have a higher risk of getting hurt in practice than you do in a game, for a couple of different reasons. Part of that's fatigue. You're practicing 3 or 4 days in a row, and if you get to the fourth day, like, you're much more likely to get injured on that day than you are on the first one, just because you're tired, your muscles are already worn out, and your technique might not be as good also. Um, and so in terms of, like, how do we cut down on that? You limit practice time. You limit how much time people have the opportunity to inflict that kind of hit. Because yeah, we can't really control games as much because there's so much money involved. But at the same time, we can say, you have this many days per week that you can practice in pads. And like, if you add too many, like, you're going to get fined if you're in the NFL, or you're going to get some type of sanction from the NCAA. Like, those are the kinds of things we can actually do. Those kind of things give me hope, as we identify those variables more carefully and with more precision. Like, I think we can significantly reduce the sort of existential threat that football was under there for a while.
Well, that's good to hear because it is like America, it's built into the fabric of America, it feels like. But out of UFC, like Ultimate Fighting, um, NASCAR, and football, which one would you said you're a stats guy. I don't know if you looked those up, but which one would you suppose has the worst CTE imaginable?
Um, that's tough. I would say, because here's the thing, there's a couple different variables in there that can make it worse or better, and it's hard to use those terms because we're talking about, like, a little bit of CTE versus a lot of CTE. It doesn't really matter. Like, I've talked to people about this before, of like, if somebody has a little bit of cancer or a lot bit of cancer, they still have cancer, right? There's
It's true.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, it's one of those things where we are trying to do some damage limitation, but in terms of, like, which one's worse, football typically, because the wearing of pads, which is supposed to protect you from having, like, the same kind of concussion trauma, actually makes it worse sometimes because people use worse technique and they hit each other harder, and it kind of puts your body in weird positions. So, like, if somebody kicks you in the face, if you're in like an MMA type of situation, um, you getting kicked is not as much of a force as somebody using their whole body as a missile, basically. Um,
Yeah,
like that, running into you like, they're a crash test dummy. Like that is going to put more force on your neck muscles, which is then going to, and depending on how strong those neck muscles are, how tired you are at that moment, it's going to limit their ability to restrict that concussive force and how much your brain actually does bounce around your head. Um, yeah, you can't kick somebody as hard as you can run into them. That's a big part of it. And because they don't have any pads, like rugby typically doesn't have as many issues with concussions because their technique is better, because they have to wrap up in a particular way to make sure that, yeah, they just do. Like there's, if you look at the way those things are, those sports are played, like they typically just hit with say like with your head up rather than head down. Yeah, because people do be using their helmets like weapons subconsciously. Because if you have one, why wouldn't you use it?
it's true.
And in that moment, especially where you're like, Derrick Henry is running at me, and he's 6'4" and weighs 250 pounds. And he's the best running back in the NFL, and he might, stiff arm me into the third row if I don't like hit him in a particular way, which is true. But at the same time, like that's how people get put in danger is in that split second, sort of forgetting all of their technical teaching and just going for a survival type deal. Which and
Yeah,
those to those big hits.
that makes sense.
Wonderful.
Like a gladiator, almost a gladiator level. They go into fight or flight. I'm gonna ram you. That's literally the game. But Paris, did you have a question?
Do you think they're more protected in NASCAR, like in the actual?
I do, yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things that, if you're a NASCAR driver or an F1 driver, especially post Dale Earnhardt dying, the level of seriousness that has gone into designing those cars has been intense in a good way. Um, Yeah, and it also in a way that you can't really do with football. Like you can't really protect somebody in quite that same way. They have incredible technology in the helmets now to be able to like limit the amount of concussive force, but it's impossible. Like you can't there's no option for a seat belt. There's no option for sort of you know bracing them to the point that they can't move. That's not possible. So even though you
Right.
are literally driving something 200 miles an hour into something else, you're protected to the point that injury and even death, the risk of that is so much lower than it used to be.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Um, yeah, looking at the list, so people a lot of times will take, you know, therapy as like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, and there is no exit strategy, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. Do you think having an exit strategy from the gate, a goal to work towards, is more beneficial than just an open-ended talking session for the rest of your life?
I think it depends, and it depends on why you're going to therapy. So, like, if you're in a condition, so like I've talked to Paris and all of my students at this point about this, but I have autism. That's not going away anytime soon. The complications that presents, like I will pretty much always need some type of counseling to be able to sort of work through that. I was thinking about this earlier. Something like depression scares me a lot more than autism does. Because like in that sense, like the suicide rate for people who experience acute depression is so much higher than people who are on the autism spectrum, have ADHD, or bipolar even. Like that's not it's not nearly so high. Bipolar is a little bit different, I should say, because there is a significant depressive component of that. But um, I think that if it is a more acute type situation, then an exit strategy is possible and probably recommended because like that is a just like you would treat a significant if somebody has like I'm trying to think of if you get like a staph infection or something, like you're going to need to be acutely treated for that thing right now. But like once it's gone, gone. Like if we're talking about psychological disorders, they don't really go away in quite the same way. But once the imminent threat has been dealt with, like yeah, you don't have to come back to the doctor at the same frequency if you have something that needs to be checked up on continuously, like diabetes, like if you have
Yeah.
a chronic condition, like in that case, not only is it good for you to be able to go in and talk about the things that you're dealing with, but like you change, like your body changes, your circumstances change, and sort of being able to update that, I think is really good. And the same approach is not always going to work, regardless of how old you are, regardless of what context you're in. So for me, the 31-year-old version of me has very different priorities, very different challenges than the 25-year-old did. And so, like, for me, going back and, getting counseled and sort of having good supports is incredibly beneficial. But if it's somebody who's experiencing panic attacks because of something very specific, that might be something that you can deal with more acutely. And then for monetary reasons and time reasons, if you wanted to work towards not having to go to therapy as consistently or at all, like I think that would be possible.
Makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. No, I totally agree. I really do. I feel like having those, like you said, persisting disorders, um, have checking in and basically testing the waters is needed for the rest of your life. Like you said, it's not going away. It's just, I even in those situations, like you also said, it's once you get some techniques to handle it and you've actually processed, like you're out of that emergency zone, you know, where things are breaking down, you can dial it back at least to where it doesn't control your life and it doesn't take away from it.
Yeah. And like you could say the same thing about medicine. Like if you're in a situation where like, at various points in my life, because I also have ADHD, and in certain points in my life, like it was unavoidable that I would be in situations where like I would have a lot of details to keep up with. I would have a schedule that I had to stick to. So like going through high school, like, classes at the same time every day. I have so much homework. I have a lot of extracurricular things. I needed help. Like I needed like some chemical help to be able to get through that. But once I made it out of there and I could make my own schedule and sort of structure things in a way that made sense to me, I didn't need to take medicine anymore because the stuff I needed help with was no longer an obstacle that I had to overcome. It was, things were a little bit more, I had different challenges, but they were challenges I could handle without having that, chemical assistance.
All right, we'll jump back in. So, because I know we just talked about like that being said with using having therapy like for your whole life. What do you feel about with SSRIs? Do you feel the same way, or do you think that's different?
I think it's similar, honestly. It also depends on like what do you want to get out of it? Like, well, what do you need? Like that, I know that's kind of vague, but um, let's say like you are chronically anxious. So like you have generalized anxiety disorder, for instance, our old friend Gad, and you are in a job that you care, let's say like you're, a lawyer or something, and you love that job, but those two things do appear to be in conflict, right? So like if you're chronically anxious and you work in a very high stakes job environment all the time, and there's deadlines that have to be met, and they're like really important deadlines, like that is the kind of situation where I'll be like, yes, please, Lord, take your medicine. Like, and that's the kind of thing where that person probably needs that. And we're talking about, a student, for instance, who goes in and is like horribly anxious about tests, or is socially anxious and has a really hard time going to school or going to work or whatever it may be. Like, yeah, SSRI, not the worst idea, because they are inherently gentler than a lot of other medicines. It's one of those things that like a lot of people don't want to be dependent, and like I totally respect that. Most of those medicines are perfectly safe, especially the SSRI variety. And through a lot of trial and error, they have sort of whittled out most of the less safe ones, and the ones that you can get addicted to is the less is the slightly more direct way to say that. But, people will still feel like I don't want to be dependent on, I don't want to feel like I have to have this medicine. I don't want it to become a crutch. I don't, you'll hear that kind of language a lot. And I respect that. Um, that is when either you might have to make a slight adjustment in your like day-to-day functioning because we talked about the 3Ds of diagnosis and dysfunction being a big one of them. Like you can adjust to that. It's not just, you've been handed in most situations, you can make adjustments around the circumstances that you're in. Like it's not quite as it's not a death sentence that you're just like, well, I'm stuck with this. Like I'm either
Yeah,
going to have to take these medicines and function normally or not take them and, just buckle up. Right?
that's
There's
true.
probably a middle ground between those two areas, and that is where something like counseling can be quite helpful. Either with a physician, so like going to see your GP or your psychiatrist and saying, hey, here's what I want and what I need and kind of where I'm at functioning wise and how the medicine is working. And that's why those conversations are important. Um, and it also doesn't happen immediately most of the time. Like there's usually some trial and error involved and people eventually finding the right balance between those things.
That's
But
true. Do you know any like natural ways like you can change your brain chemistry basically? Like if people don't want to take drugs.
it's going to sound boring, but diet and exercise and finding things that you enjoy doing, like that's kind of it's a bit of a cliche, but it's because it works. Like
It's true.
body,
Yeah.
the food that you eat matters, the sleep that you get really matters, not just the physical stimulation that you get from exercise, but also the intellectual, mental, emotional stimulation that you get from those things. We've talked in class about like it's not just, I don't, you're playing video games because they're fun, but they can also stimulate those areas in your brain that, create that give you the happy chemicals and the balancing chemicals in a healthy way, that where it's not, taking a medicine necessarily that just like pumps a bunch of that chemical into your brain.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, that would be the first way, I would say, but also isolating kind of the things that might exacerbate symptoms. So thinking about like if I'm anxious, like what about my, work or social patterns makes me anxious? Like what things in my specific day-to-day life are what are the things that are sort of making those things worse, and can I change them? And if I can, um, how can I have conversations that get me to a better place? Like that kind of stuff.
Sticking with that real quick, the dependency, saying for people who don't want to be physically dependent, but might need to be
Mhm.
at a stage in their life, would later down the line, when they have a transition and of life events, would it be beneficial to come off of that so your brain doesn't become attuned to needing it?
Well, I think that's where that we talked earlier about that sort of reassessing conversation with a practitioner is helpful because you can be like, okay, well, I'm having this big change. I'm changing jobs. Maybe like you go from working in an office to being able to work remote. And that is going to cause a pretty significant change in your functioning, and that might actually be the key to, I don't necessarily need to take my medicine anymore because I don't have to worry about transportation. I don't have to worry about childcare potentially. Like there's a lot of things that sort of shakes up. So revisiting that is kind of it's pretty important. Like, and any of those big life changes, those are good times to sort of reassess. Okay, do I need these medicines anymore? How much of them do I need? Are there other changes that I can make now that I have a little bit more control over that kind of thing? Like those are where those conversations are useful.
You got it, Paris.
Okay. Um, because I remember we also had some sport questions for you. Because especially, sports and psychology, I know Jack was talking to me about, for example, of like Jackie Robinson,
Hmm.
and the his amazing stat records, like well known for, being the first Black person to really make it in the big leagues, where, seen by everybody. And so the racial pressures, though, at the time, and like how that can, mentally affect you in all kinds of different ways. Uh, what do you have an opinion on that? Like, I guess for people in these kind of really high level performing jobs and like their mental aspect of like what's going on socially, and does that make them better? Like, does that make it better or does it make it worse? What do you think?
I have lots of thoughts about this. The first one is that just talking about Jackie Robinson specifically, like in terms of like unique humans, I really don't know if the way that his introduction into Major League Baseball went, and it wasn't great. Like there, it was not super smooth. One of my like I the movie 42, which Chadwick Boseman stars Jackie Robinson in, R.I.P. He was terrific as Jackie Robinson, but they can't really portray the nastiness that Jackie Robinson actually experienced in uh, coming into the major leagues, which at the time, again, we can think about Major League Baseball now, where there's teams all over the country. It was a lot more regionalized at that point. Like that was pre-baseball being in California. Like it was pretty much St. Louis East. Okay, it was
Yeah.
a fundamentally different place. And like in that context, for him to have made it through that as successfully as he did, because that's the other thing about Jackie Robinson, other than him just being just like a lion of a man, being able to put up with all that, that dude was good. Like, if you look at his baseball reference page, which is something that I enjoy doing in my free time, he put up some numbers. Like he was legitimately one of the best baseball players of all time. And like that wasn't even his best sport. Like he was really good at several other things at UCLA, like Olympic level track athlete and multiple other things. Like in terms of how lucky we were to have him be the first guy through that door is like insane. I have a feeling that the people around the time who were like, do we want to break the color barrier now? I feel like they probably assessed Jackie Robinson and said, yeah, this is the guy. This is the one to kind of make it through. Because yeah, in terms of like how it affected his performance, I don't know. I don't the circumstances of that I think are so alien to what we could think about today. Like there's no real comparison for it in terms of I said nastiness earlier, like the vitriol that he would have experienced, not just from fans, but people within his own organization who were not just sort of dealing with him as a man, but the stresses that they experienced and how that affected the way that they saw him and like how that affected them going on road trips and the abuse that they got, which they then internalized and then projected onto him, like that kind of thing. He was just a sponge for so many people's insecurities and difficulty with wrapping their heads around the concept that a black player could be anywhere as near as good, and at that point, better than basically all of the white players.
Yeah.
Like that was a lot to take on at once, and um, yeah, I don't think anybody else could have done it.
No, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Mhm.
Did you have one, Jack?
Well, I would stand with the same, older baseball players.
Mhm.
Babe Ruth being on the Hall of Fame, and everybody knows Babe Ruth. He's like a household name. Do you think that in comparison to other people's batting averages and their performances on the field, that it might actually just be the fact that we knew his name first rather than he's the best?
I think that's part of it. He was in terms of like stardom, and a lot of this was helped by where he played. So he played in Boston first and then in New York, obviously. That's where most people remember Babe Ruth from playing in. And he was on some unbelievable Yankees teams. And he fundamentally changed the way the game was played, which is a big part of like why he's so well remembered. Like if you go back and look at his baseball reference page, which I have definitely done, it doesn't look like anybody else's. Like the numbers are bigger than everybody else's numbers. It and like and to an unfathomable extent. Like prior to him, he hit 60 home runs in one season. Like it was relatively rare for people to get double digits at all at that point. Like it wasn't, you fast forward to, skipping over the 1990s because that was the steroid era. If we talk about the last few years, like if a guy like Matt Olson for the Braves, who's my favorite team, like he hit 53, I want to say, but like in that same season, you're gonna have multiple different guys hit 40. Like that's usually around where the top hitters come in. Babe Ruth, it was like, 45. Babe Ruth dropped down a whole lot into like maybe the high teens, low 20s, and that's where somebody else would have been. And one of my favorite developments that is happening is I'm a big statistics nerd when it comes to baseball, is we have stats now that can normalize people's numbers. So we can compare eras. So like how would you think about comparing like Sammy Sosa to Babe Ruth? Well, you can take their home run totals, their slugging percentage, their on base percentage, and compare it to what everybody else was doing around that time. And you can use that as a statistic to compare across decades. And one of the wildest things that happens is there's a stat called OPS plus, which basically is on base plus slugging, and then you normalize it to like 100 is average. There's been like a handful of baseball players that have had a 200 OPS plus in a season, which means that they're basically as good as two normal players, and then some on top of that. Like Babe Ruth would have had like 4 or 5 of those kind of seasons in a row. Like he was that level of better than everybody else. And a lot of that just came down to um, his approach. This is an oversimplification, but he swung harder than everybody else did. Because like a lot of, especially early baseball was so much about like slap hitting and getting singles and stealing bases and hitting and running and stuff like that. Babe Ruth sort of clocked into the idea that like, well, if I hit it over the fence, nobody else can catch it. And that idea has persisted a lot. Like there's a stat called BABIP, which or expected batting average is probably a better one. So like if a player hits a baseball at a particular exit velocity off the bat and at a particular launch angle, we could say it has an expected batting average of like 600, which is awesome. But like if you hit it to a good center fielder, like they can still catch that. However, if you hit it 450 feet, that has an expected batting average of 1,000 because nobody can catch that. So like he was sort of Moneyball before Moneyball, 100 years before Moneyball was going to be a thing. Babe Ruth kind of clocked into the idea of like, well, if I hit a lot of home runs, I'll walk more, I'll get on base more often, and I'll look like the best player who's ever picked up a bat, which some people would still say that he was. Um, but I think a lot of that comes down to approach also.
Right. He reminds me a lot of Hank Aaron with what you're saying, pointing to that field. Uh, yeah. It makes sense that you would try and optimize the game and change your approach. Uh, switching gears here, could you explain the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath for us? If you know.
What a question. So I do want to say, and we talked about this in our Psych 201 class, that technically we don't really use these terms anymore. And so psychopath and sociopath have both been bundled into the idea of antisocial personality disorder. So, and being antisocial sort of covers both of those bases. I'm actually going to look this up because I kind of know what this means. All right, sociopath versus psychopath. And Paris has seen me do this before. I'm a very good live Googler. So
Same
psychopath
here.
more manipulative, charming, while sociopaths are more impulsive and emotionally erratic. So it looks like the difference is like sociopaths are a little easier to spot, which would make sense in the because if you look at the root words like sociopath, we're looking at their social behaviors, whereas psychopath, we're looking at more their like cognitive processes. So
That makes
that
sense.
would be definitionally the difference in terms of how we perceive that. It looks like, yeah, so calculating, manipulative, and charming, those are the psychopaths. Um, Manipulative and deceitful, that would be more along the lines of sociopathy. Again, I could be wrong on that. That's not like my specialty personally. But a lot of people who, watch a lot of Criminal Minds get way into that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, which is very
Oh yeah.
interesting. Something I try to impress on my students is like, because a lot of them will end up in my class because they're like, "Oh, I really want to like figure out how serial killers work." I'm like, "Well, you kind of came to the wrong place, because that's like a percentage point of a percentage point of what we're going to talk about in here, because that's a very, very, very small section of the population." Um, yeah, just on a side note, I've been watching a lot of CBS recently because we've been catching up on the last season of Survivor, and they have a new Criminal Minds show where they're like the group of bad guys is like a network of serial killers, and like it sounds very exciting, right? It's also insane, right? Like the idea of that is so beyond the pale of reality that I'm just like, why, guys, why are we doing this? Like hundreds of thousands of people are going to watch that and sort of get the wrong idea about what being a sociopath, being antisocial actually is. Most of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, people who have those two conditions, which is now again been wrapped up into one condition, are not violent. That's just yeah, an important distinction to make.
And
I
then
agree.
you want to do the next one first?
Yeah, because I do really agree. I think you know, how they paint people with mental illness in media is insane. And because we're actually gonna start talking about like some TV show people with mental illness.
Mm,
So that's the funny part about that is I think it's easier for us to kind of like look at a TV show that, it talks about like a famous serial killer. So like we talked about Dexter a
mhm,
lot recently and like something like that with it's like a person who was on a TV board that was like, here are the things that we know about what a psychopath or sociopath is. And what is it like if I put this person in this scenario, like they're like this and they have this idea, and you have a little bit more idea of like a projection, but it's not a real life person.
mhm,
So you don't have to kind of, feel the weight of the issue, versus looking at like real life serial killers, like Ted Bundy or something like that, where he was associated or, I don't know exactly like what he would be classified as now with the new um, definitions, but they called him a sociopath and he actually murdered people and but people still glorify him. So it's kind of like um I guess our escape to TV shows with these kind of labels on them that kind of give it a fun laughing at this idea of what people think a person with sociopathy or psychopathy would do.
mhm.
Most of them are all narcissists, I think, is really what the baseline a lot of these interesting TV show characters are. And I know that you said that you had like a show where you talk about TV and everything like that. And
Yeah. I may get into that on that platform at some point. It That gets real. So like I'm very wary from my past dealings on YouTube of the comment section and just like what an absolute you know what show that could deteriorate into so quickly. Um, because I do have thoughts about a lot of those kinds of things. And to pivot away to something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, the presentation of autism specifically on a lot of shows. Like if you have a character that is like openly autistic and you have
yeah,
described them as such, there's been a couple of pretty good ones. So my wife's a big fan of Grey's Anatomy, and there is actually a pretty good depiction of a doctor who's on the spectrum on that show. But most of the time, they do lean into stereotypes. My favorite thing is what I call an accidental autism, where you have a character who codes as autistic and does a lot of autism-y things, and they never say it, and they just sort of like present them as quirky or really needing to have things done in a particular way, or have a lot of information about this very random topic, that kind of.
Sheldon Cooper, kind of.
Yeah, and so like Sheldon is a good example. Like he is overt in the way that he is like socially different, He's a world class. They're physicists, right?
Yeah.
Is that
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, so that's part of it. Autistic people do tend to be relatively high achieving when it comes to academics and intelligence, which is like a whole other conversation. But um, my favorite thing again is like when people sort of accidentally depict autism in or a piece of it in a way that is actually congruent with how it works. Um, the example that I was thinking of, because I'm making a video about Superman right now, in Man of Steel, there's a moment where young Superman, so little Clark Kent, he's like 10 or something. He's starting to like realize that he has powers, and he's because he has, super hearing and super smell and super sight, and all of it is coming on at once. And so he's just like completely overwhelmed. He's sitting there in the classroom like, "Oh my God." Like everything is like completely just he can't pay attention. The teacher is like giving a lecture and he like can't focus on it obviously because he's hearing everything that's going on around him for, potentially miles. And his solution to that is to go and lock himself in a closet until they call his mom. And like that to me, I'm looking at that, I'm like, that's autism. There you go. Right? Like that kind of thing. That's the way, that's what it really looks like a lot of the time. Just that like persistent overstimulation and like that desire to just like go in a place that shuts all of it out. And until your mom comes and helps, right? Um, that kind of thing is we talk about like depiction of disorders. A lot of times, sort of those more subconscious thoughts about it are actually better than the ones, and because like those like neuroses that are more common and like people have a more personal connection with, those tend to be represented a little bit more authentically than if we other autism or other somebody being bipolar or um, somebody having ADHD or somebody being schizophrenic, like if we say, oh, that's the other thing over there, I don't, have anything in common with that person, like that's, and I'm going to write it in such a way that it's apparent that I think I have very little common with that person. The things that the common ground that we recognize either intentionally or unintentionally tends to be written and portrayed better in those situations, in my opinion.
Um, Staying with that though, I just wanted to mention some other characters really quick in a speed fire and see if you've heard of them, and if you have, do they exhibit some of the qualities we're talking about? House for antisocial personality disorder. How he's so standoff. Everything about House really. It's
Mhm.
I don't know. At least narcissism with him. We got Dexter Morgan, Walter White being also antisocial personality disorder, like you said, because
Mhm.
educated me there. And then Joe Goldberg, antisocial personality disorder.
Which one's Joe Goldberg from?
He's from Netflix show. You might not have seen it because if you watch cable, then it's only
Mhm.
on Netflix. But he's from the show You, and basically he
Okay.
suffers from erotomania, where he like falls in love with people and
Mhm.
controls stuff.
And that's Penn Badgley, like that. Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna put Walter White and Dexter over to the side, because they kill people. Um, that is important to remember in this kind of thing. So like you mentioned Ted Bundy earlier. Um, if we're talking about Ted Bundy, we're talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. The most important thing to remember about those guys is they were murderers.
Yeah.
So, whether they were antisocial or not kind of takes a back seat to the homicide. That's the important thing for me, for people to remember is like that should be the headline, right? So like killed people, chopped them up into bits. Like that is the thing that you need to remember about that person.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's entirely possible with Dexter and Walter White, because what they do is they make decisions. They essentially sacrifice people of like, I have this thing that I need to do to get what I want. And that would be a very like antisocial tendency of like, no matter who this affects, like I'm going to do this thing regardless of who's sort of in the crosshairs here. I don't care if it gets somebody else killed or put in jail. Like that is uh, immaterial to me. Doesn't matter. With Walter White, especially initially, I think it is a little bit different because he is dying of cancer. And so there is that like existential threat to him of like, Yeah, okay, you kind of get it in terms of like I'm going to do basically whatever it takes to not only, keep myself alive as long as I can, but like provide for my wife and son who is disabled in a way to not do because I'm a teacher, right? So that one hits a little close to home, but at the same time, like, it is important to sort of put them in their own category. Um, Remind me who the first one was?
So House for
House.
antisocial personality disorder.
So it's interesting. I would probably put House in the autistic realm.
Makes
Um,
sense.
he definitely has some of those tendencies of that sort of like very black and white, like I'm very smart. This is either a right answer or a wrong answer, and I'm not really gonna bother with the pleasantries of telling you that your answer is wrong. Um, because a lot of people do get those things confused, sort of like antisocial tendencies versus more spectrumy tendencies. I would say because he doesn't quite have that same level of manipulativeness, and he doesn't have that like nobody dies in quite the same way. And he doesn't have that like I'm willing to sacrifice the people around me like in their careers potentially for my own benefit. Like I would say he's more in the socially unaware, really intelligent, can't quite get on the same page with people's motivations sometimes, like that kind of thing.
I know that. Wow, that's actually, I totally agree with you. You actually, I changed my mind there on that for real, because that makes a lot of sense. Um, wow, that just hit pretty home. Because I'm thinking back to the show and multiple moments where he doesn't mean harm to someone, but
Mhm.
he just doesn't understand.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Low-key. All right, so wrapping it up, because gotta, don't want to keep it too long. You gotta go be a sports psychologist. Um, so analyzing, all psychoanalyzing can be so fun, almost like a recreational pastime. We talk about
Mhm.
that. Um, if you have someone in your family who is potentially, you know, suffering or ha I don't know, I want to frame this a certain way, but have antisocial personality disorder or something to that effect where it can cause them to become manipulative and destructive, what would you tell that person to how they could, what would you say to them that could help them basically not control, because then you
Handle the situation.
Yeah, would you say it's better to distance yourself or try and make it work with that person?
So there's a couple things I want to say here. First of all, the biggest thing that you can do there is leverage the relationship. Like the relationship is the biggest factor there. And what I would recommend not doing, and this is like I try and communicate this as effectively as I can to my students, is like when we teach about psychology and we talk about psychological disorders, the goal is not for people to go home and think, okay, well, this person in my life is clearly schizophrenic. This person's a narcissist. This person, like, it's so tempting, but don't do it. Right? That's not what that's there for. And sort of the antidote to that is that relationship, right? Because if you're coming to them saying, hey, here's this thing that you did that upset me. Hey, here's this behavioral pattern that I see you're getting into that I don't think is necessarily the healthiest for you. Um, that kind of thing I think is incredibly beneficial. It's and if you have enough of those conversations, like eventually maybe you could lead to the point where you're like, hey, I mean that's one of the ways that I found out that I might have autism is like somebody, tiptoeing in that direction and like continually being frustrated by things and then having conversations with my wife and a couple of other people that I'm close to. So I know I'm kind of like sounding like I'm being slightly contradictory there. Again, the difference there is the relationship. Is the like focusing on that first, and then like I'm telling you this stuff because I want to help you. Here's this like specific situation, and sort of going from the inside out rather than saying, "All right, guy, you're definitely like you got some bipolar stuff going on here. You need to go to the doctor." Like nobody enjoys hearing that, and nobody, um, I wouldn't say nobody, but like most people are not going to respond particularly well to that. But because people do have relationships with other people and have opinions that they value and people that they cherish and sort of value what they think, like that kind of thing can be very helpful and sort of taking baby steps towards maybe getting some help.
If someone's harming you, though, would you feel a certain kind of obligation to stay and fix that, or would you just,
Ooh. Um, I think it depends. If it's like a family member, so like a sibling or somebody that you're in a relationship with, like that kind of thing, um, I don't think you're necessarily obligated to. Like it's just and some people you are stuck with. So like
yeah,
it's like you kind of have to find that balance of like, do I have to make this work? Like, is this person going to be at all of the family gatherings that I'm going to want to come to in the future? And is this potentially going to complicate that? You also don't have to do it all by yourself because they possibly also have other relationships that you could help leverage and sort of have conversations with that other person. Be like, hey, this is appearing to be an issue with this person. Maybe we could both talk to them about it indirectly or directly if things get bad enough. Because it also depends on how dysfunctional things are getting and how much distress they're causing not only themselves but other people. Because yeah, if life's a graph, right? So we have like on the x-axis bad things that are happening, problems that are being caused. Why would be acceptability of sort of intervening in that situation, if that makes
getting
sense?
higher? Yeah, and more exponential. Did you have any finishing questions, Paris?
Um, no, not really. I guess the only question I have is, do you think a psychologist could use their power for evil?
Well, they have. That's that. I think it's fairly irrefutable. We talked about John Watson, for instance, sort of semi-torturing infants. Well, that same guy went on to like make a whole bunch of money in marketing, sort of manipulating people's buying patterns. And there's a lot of the theory that was developed around that time sort of created our modern understanding of marketing. And that has been played forward to like the millionth degree with social media and algorithms and things like that. So yes, absolutely. Psychological principles can be used for evil, in a variety of different ways.
That's true. That's all my question.
All
Mhm.
right. I want to thank you, Will, for
Cool.
being on the podcast, and yeah, just I appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank you. We're gonna, put a list of like all of the things that you're doing. You send us the link of like your shows and everything. We'll put it on here and put it in the bio and everything too for everybody to go and check out.
Thank you
Everybody
so
go
much.
check him out. Yeah, Will, he's a great guy. He's got a vast range of knowledge, so go check him out.